Hey everyone, and welcome back to another report. So, when you dive into it, EA's most recent leaks show the absolute worst side of AAA development. They give us a lot to cover, and they show the difference in incentive structures for the key decision makers at major publishers, and how really they're pretty different to what we as players of games would want. Yet, even with that, there may be a bit of Respawn Entertainment-shaped hope. Now, if you're new here, then hello, we're a narrative game studio. Hit up our mailing list below for more info. We do 6 game industry news and analysis videos per week, so sub if you want more of that stuff. Then also, your likes and your comments massively help us out with the algorithm. They have done, we really appreciate it. And with that, let's get into the video. So, according to new reports, EA cancelled a planned spin-off for Star Wars Battlefront. Now, this game, codenamed Viking, was initially slated for a full release alongside the new generation of consoles. But it was officially cancelled in the first half of 2019. Now, Viking marks the third Star Wars title that EA have cancelled since 2017, and Kotaku's Jason Schreier went on to just go into a bit of detail about the projects. I mean, it's funny, from 2017 through 19, they've cancelled one a year. So, Ragtag is the first dead game. That was the heist-centric Star Wars game from Visceral and Amy Hennig that was worked on, I think, over 2 years before Ragtag and Visceral themselves were shuttered. Now, the next title, Orca, was announced alongside Visceral Games' shutdown. Now, this was an open-worlded adventure that was in development all throughout 2018, before being axed at the start of last year. Now, word has it here that EA's top decision makers, obviously the best in the business, looked at Orca's 2-year roadmap for development and decided that they needed to do something sooner than when Orca's actual expected release date would be. Basically, whatever the game was did not fit in with the financial plan. So instead of doing Orca, reports at the time suggested that Orca was cancelled to make room for a smaller scale Star Wars title that could release feasibly in 2020 alongside the new wave of consoles, a very important time for anyone in the game's business. This game would have been Viking. Now, Viking was envisioned to be a spin-off of the popular Star Wars Battlefront 2, which seems to make sense because Battlefront 2 now seems to be a game that's doing a lot better by its players, and would also contain open-world elements similar to Orca. But also, like Orca, Viking's development timeline may have been its undoing. So, Viking, a collaboration between EA Vancouver and the London-based Criterion Games, was supposed to release this year, 2020. Criterion, technically speaking, were the lead studio for the project, and the prospect of, game design across borders did of course bring its own challenges. One of the sources that spoke to Kotaku claimed that Viking was a too many cooks kind of situation, something that I think if you've ever even done a uni project, I think you know what that can feel like. Now, Criterion had grand ambitions for the project. They apparently wanted a strong focus on its story and its characters, but this vision ended up making it clear that the game would never be done in a year and a half, which is an insane dev timeline. The EA execs had no interest in amending that timeline, and thus Viking was put in the bin. Now, here's the thing. If they just stuck to one of these darn projects, they probably would have got it out there. I think that this is basically just quarterly earnings call money chasing. This is them looking at their slate across multiple years thinking, we need to fill this hole, say like Holiday 2020, pretty major one. And it's that situation where that being the system of incentives that the key decision makers who are actually making the decisions are, that's what rules them, not the people who make the games because they want to make good games. That's really the problem here. That has robbed us at least 2 games, because Orca and Viking, they likely would have been pretty decent games. Maybe they would have been 7 out of 10s, but whatever, right? They probably would have been decent enough games. But because neither of them could perfectly fit into the timeline, well, they got killed. Now, the only way I could be charitable to the decision makers at EA here is that it's a opportunity cost thing, right? Because Criterion are a pretty incredible studio in terms of what they can pump out. So if you put Criterion on this project for 18 months and you then know, well, that 18 months isn't really going to plan out, then you're maybe going to think, well, is the opportunity cost of Criterion making this game, that game coming out and it doing well, is that higher than if we got Criterion to do another thing that could do even better in a way that worked better for our timeline? That's the kind of decisions that they'll be making over there at EA. It's not just a completely blind, F games, etc. sort of thing, but certainly from the consumer perspective, when we think about our experience as people who enjoy this medium, who want more games to play, we do kind of think, well, guys, if you had have just made two of those projects a little bit slower, at least one of them would probably be out soon. We probably would have bought it and you would have had more money overall. So it's just that sort of thing, isn't it? It just really does show, times, deadlines. I mean, look at Anthem, right? Anthem was rushed out that quarter. That's just what happens. This is what kills good games. This is exactly, I would say, what we do not want in the industry. It also does show, I think, the inner workings of companies like EA. It gives you just a little bit of a look at that the short-term trend chasing. Now, it is worth me saying this was cancelled before Respawn did Fallen Order. Now, even Fallen Order, that shipped with a few bugs, but that's because they had to hit that date. And at the end of the day, yeah, Christmas is extremely important for Star Wars, so I will cut them a bit of slack in having a few shippable bugs for that timeline, and I can see how for Orca and for Viking, 2020 would matter, but I think you still get my point. Now, the hope here is that Respawn have really shown EA just a more wised up way of actually making games, and that problems like this will not continue. Now, before we wrap this up, there are two side topics that I'd like to cover. The first one is Criterion games. Now, Criterion, what do they do really well? They do vehicles really well. You'd think, ideally, they should be working mainly on the vehicle-first games, such as, say, the Need for Speed franchise, whereas previously that had actually been put onto Ghost Games. Why? Well, because Criterion were basically being ping-ponged around, trying to fix things for EA and actually make things possible. So, what have Criterion done recently? Well, in Star Wars Battlefront 2, the ship combat was, for somebody like me who really does enjoy their ship combat games, it was pretty simple, but it was very fun, very accessible ship combat that was very well implemented. So they did that, and I think are responsible for a lot of the initial good in Star Wars Battlefront 2. But then after that, they were also stuck on working on Firestorm. Yup, that part of Battlefield 5 that nobody really cared about, nobody really asked for, but we sort of got anyway, and seemingly at the expense of a fair amount of Battlefield 5 content. Now, of course, knowing that they were doing that, and then they were on to Viking, it's actually decently clear that Criterion were basically just being ping-ponged around, helping in a project here, helping another one there, then leading their own project, which then ended up falling apart. So really, that's a studio that it just seems like, to be honest with you, got a bit dicked over by upper management. Now, there's another side to this where, while Criterion were being dicked over by upper management, Ghost Games were leading on Need for Speed. Of course, it seems like, from what we know there, Ghost Games are now back to being more of a Frostbite engine support studio, while Criterion have been moved back onto Need for Speed. Now, it is pretty interesting. Like, I think Reykjavik, I always forget how to say his name, YouTuber, he recently did a Need for Speed video that actually surprised me in how it presented the game, actually looking quite fun and not being full of microtransactions and stuff. So maybe if that franchise is actually on the up and Criterion are kind of going back to what they do best, maybe that does actually bode well for EA, though certainly if we are to think about opportunity cost, I mean, Criterion making Need for Speed, I can see that going super well. Criterion leading a new Star Wars game, I would have imagined that would have made more money, but hey, I suppose that's just me. Now, there is one final thing to talk about. For a decent amount of time, there have been Star Wars, the Old Republic, or like basically KOTOR rumors, right? Are you going to get a KOTOR remastered or a new KOTOR game, something like that going on as a part of EA and Disney's agreement for the Star Wars franchise. And right now, we don't actually know anything. A bunch of people, in response to the main article that prompted this video, asked Jason Schreier if there were any updates there, and he basically said, he didn't want to share stuff when he wasn't like 100% sure. So that's an interesting one. My read in there is that Jason was not giving a hard denial to people talking about that, but also he obviously does not have enough that he'd be comfortable going to press with it to actually print that story. I mean, print. It's digital, of course, but you get what I mean. Now, obviously, I'd love another KOTOR game. If it came from a good BioWare and was kind of a resurgence, that would be lovely. Now, on the topic of old RPGs coming up, there actually has been, or old style RPGs, there's been a lot of good news. So actually, do stay tuned to the channel. We will be doing a deeper look into that, because seriously, if you're into core RPGs, it has been a pretty good time, and I actually think it might be a very good time over the next few years. But anyway, that is it for this video. A dive into really just like the parts of AAA, those incentive structures that lead to decisions being made that do make sense within those incentive structures of the decision makers at the top of the AAA publishers, but that don't necessarily gel with what our, as customers, our ideal outcomes would be. It certainly is an interesting topic, and it's one that, is a little bit sad sometimes, I will be real with you. But anyway, let me know. What did you think about this story? What do you want to see from EA and Star Wars, I guess? Do you want a KOTOR? Let me know know down below. Thank you very much for watching this video. There will be another one up on the channel today, so check it out as well, and I'll see you next time.